Okay, we'll start. So last week I stated the Mermin-Wagner theorem, and I would like to give a proof now. Maybe let me just recall the setting. So proof of Mermin-Wagner theorem. And I will only give you the proof in the case where the spin takes value in the circle, and the general proof for n larger or equal to 3 can actually be reduced to this particular case, and you will do that in exercises. Okay. So the setting is as follows. So we are looking at configurations which are obtained by attaching a two-dimensional unit vector to each vertex of ZD. The spin, so if I take omega, the configuration, then we introduced the spin Si of omega, which was just omega I. And since these spins take value in the circle, it's very convenient to parameterize them by the angle, say cos theta I of omega, sin theta I of omega. Okay, so this defines some random variable theta I, which I assume takes value between minus pi and pi. Okay. Then the Hamiltonian in lambda, say inverse temperature beta, was written as the sum over all edges of the function, I called it W, I think, of the scalar product between Si and Sj. And this, of course, you can rewrite in terms of the angles as a function v of, say, theta j minus theta I, where v, say, v of x, is just W of cosine of x. Okay. So that was the setting. And the claim was that in such a setting, in dimension 1 and 2, any infinite volume Gibbs state that you can construct for this associated to such a Hamiltonian, say, will be invariant under the action of the rotations of all the spins. Okay, so I will not restate the theorem now because I'm actually going to state a more precise result with more quantitative result, which is the one we are going to prove. So it's proposition 812. Takes the following form. So we assume that dimension is 1 or 2, and n is equal to 2. Okay. And the theorem is the proposition is as follows. So assume that the interaction W, which is here, is C2, so twice continuously differentiable. Then there exists constant C1, C2, such that for any local function f, any boundary condition eta, any inverse temperature beta, and any angle psi in minus pi, we have the following claim. So if I look at the expected value of the local function f, say in some box lambda, I've taken Bn. In the box Bn, inverse temperature beta with boundary condition eta, and I compare it with the expected value of f after application of a rotation of angle psi. So this will denote a rotation of all the spins by the angle psi. Boundary condition eta in Bn. Inverse temperature beta, then this quantity. So the Mermin-Wagner theorem was basically telling you that for the infinite volume Gibbs state, this quantity would be 0, but this gives you a quantitative counterpart. So this difference is bounded by beta 1/2 psi, the sup norm of f, times And then some factor which depends on dimension. So in dimension 1, it's C1 over square root of n. That's for dimension 1. And it's C2 square root of L. I will tell you what L is in a second. Over square root of log n. That's for dimension 2. Where, so arc psi is the rotation by, of all spins by psi, and L is such that, say, the support of the local function f is included inside Bn. So something which measures the size of the support of f. Okay, in that sense. Okay, so get an upper bound on this difference, which is uniform in the boundary conditions. So C1 and C2 do not depend on the boundary condition. Okay. It's a very strong claim. It gives you result in dimension 1, dimension 2. But for the proof that I'm going to write down now, I'm taking an arbitrary dimension. We'll see where the dimension appears, and we'll see why the proof does not give you anything in dimension 3 and higher, and should not give you anything in dimension 3 and higher, since the result is wrong in this case, as we will see in the following weeks. Okay, so one thing that I will let you do as an exercise, not difficult, is to extract from this result the following two claims. So deduce that on one hand, if you look at the, I'm thinking how I should write it. So look at the spin at the origin, so with boundary condition eta, in the box Bn, gas temperature beta. And look at, so you take the expected value of the spin, say maybe for the boundary condition you take everybody pointing towards the right, so along E1. Okay, then you might wonder whether S0 will also point in the direction of E1. So you take the expected value of the you take the spin in the middle of the box, take the expected value, then you take the norm of this guy, then prove that this is smaller than exactly as before. Size C prime over square root of n in dimension 1, and say, okay, C second over square root of log n in dimension 2. Okay, and similarly, prove also that for any infinite volume Gibbs state, we have that if you look at S0 scalar product Si, say, under this Gibbs state, okay, then this decays as what? Some constant over square root of I in dimension 1, and some constant over square root of log I in dimension 2. Okay, so you get from this result in particular the fact that the spontaneous magnetization vanish always, and with some rate at which it vanishes, and there is no long-range order in the sense that if I take two spins which are very far away from each other, then the projection of one spin on the other is going to zero with the distance between the spins. Okay, so that's not very difficult. And of course, as before, all these constants, C prime and C second, for example, here, they are uniform in the boundary condition. Okay, okay, so let's turn to the proof of proposition 812. So in the proposition, I'm applying a rotation of all the angle of all the spins in the box by psi, but actually the function f only care about the spins which live on its support. Okay, somewhere maybe I make a picture. So we have the box Bn, I will just write lambda in this proof for Bn because I don't want to write Bn too many times. It takes too much time. And then we have this boundary condition eta outside. Then we have F, which has its support somewhere here, and take the smallest box Bl, say, which contains, that's Bl, which contains the support of F. Okay? So that's this setting. And now, before computing this expectation, I take all the spins in the system and I rotate them by psi. But actually, it would be enough to rotate only the spins on the support of F because F does not see what happens elsewhere. F is a local function, it only sees what happens on its support. Okay? So I would like to, instead of applying here a rotation of all the spins everywhere on ZD by the same angle psi, I would like to do something similar to what we did in the heuristic argument last week. That is, I would like to introduce one of these inhomogeneous rotation where I will rotate on the support of F, I will rotate the spin by psi, but outside the box I will rotate the spin by 0, I will just not touch them, and in between I will try to smoothly interpolate between this rotation by psi in the center and the rotation by 0 outside the box. Okay? This will not change anything for this expectation because F does not see what happens elsewhere than on its support, but it will allow us maybe to show that these two expectations are not too far away because we are actually making this smooth deformation which is very, very cheap as we saw last week in heuristic argument. Energetically, it does not cost anything as soon as n is very large. Okay, so that's what I would like to do. So let me try to set up some notation. So I will introduce what played the role of the spin wave last week, which will be a function psi defined on the lattice, taking value, say, in minus pi. And what I want is that, so such that psi of I is equal to 0 for all I which do not belong to the box. Okay, I said I called it lambda now for all vertices which do not belong to the box lambda, and psi of I will take it equal to the small psi, the rotation I want to apply here, or say minus psi, it will be more convenient, for all I which are in BL. So BL contains the support of F, so that's fine. Okay. So for the moment, I'm only asking for these two properties, and then at some point in the proof, later in the proof, we will find the best possible such function, okay, for our purposes. So among all functions with this boundary condition, I will choose the best one later on. Okay. So that's just some function, some configuration if you want. And now I would like to introduce an operator that will take a configuration that will make this inhomogeneous rotation. So it will rotate the spin which is located at vertex I by the angle psi I. So this operator, I will denote it by T psi. So it acts on configurations. Okay. And it acts in such a way that the angle at a vertex I of the configuration T psi omega is just the angle in the original configuration omega plus psi I. And this is for all I. Okay? So I'm rotating the spins. All the guys there, they're rotating by psi. All the guys there, they are not rotated at all. And in the middle, in between, they are rotated by what is given by the function capital psi here, which we will choose later. Okay. So that's the construction. So let me just point out a few properties that I've said already, but it would be useful to have them written down somewhere. Okay, so observations. So it follows from the definition that, so the first observation, psi acts as the identity outside lambda. It acts as the rotation by small psi inside lambda BL. Okay, first observation. Second observation is that this, oh, sorry, I should say tip psi. I'm really thinking about the rotation operator. And then tip psi, oh, sorry, it's rotation by minus psi. Okay. The inverse of this operator tip psi, which make this inhomogeneous rotation, is just given by t minus psi, obviously. I just make the rotation by the opposite angle at each vertex. Okay. And the last observation is that the Jacobian of the transformation omega goes to t psi omega is 1. Okay. That just comes from the fact that it's just translation in each coordinate. So when you compute the Jacobian, you get the identity matrix. Okay. Okay, so these are just some observations, but with this observation we can start to work. So let's look at the quantity we're interested in, which is this expectation here. That's the hard one. So we have f composed with this rotation by an angle psi eta lambda. Let me omit the parameter beta. It's constant in the proof. It will play no role. So I will not write it down. So this is, by definition, 1 over the partition function, eta lambda. Then we have the integral of f of r psi omega e minus h lambda of omega, product over all I in lambda d omega I. Okay. Just the definition of the expected value of this quantity. Okay. Now the observation, that was the reason why we did it this way, we introduced this function tip psi, is that this r psi of omega, I can replace it. It's equal to t minus psi omega on the support of f. Okay, it's equal actually to that on the whole of BL, but BL contains the support of f. So in particular on the support of f, I can replace r psi omega by t minus psi omega. It doesn't change anything. Okay, and f only cares about what happens on its support, so I can make this substitution. It does not change anything. So let's do the substitution. So I get 1 over z lambda eta integral of f of t, I said minus psi omega e minus h lambda omega product over I in lambda d omega I. Okay. Good. Now I'll make a change of variable. What I will do is that this quantity here, t minus psi omega, I will call it omega. Omega tilde, whatever. Okay, change variable so that this is omega now. And then I get 1 over, this is just a constant, nothing changes. Then I get f of omega after I've made my change of variable. Then e minus h lambda. Oh, the notation I used last week, I think it was, let me do it like last week. It was omega in lambda, eta in lambda complement. I think I wrote it like that, right? Just so that we don't change notation from one week to the other. So h lambda, and now here I have to consider omega lambda eta lambda complement, and I've acted with the inverse operator. Okay, and then the product is still just the product of the omega I, since the Jacobian of the transformation is equal to 1. Okay, so we get this expression. So again, so I'm computing the expectation of this function f composed with this rotation. I've managed to rewrite it as it's not yet an expectation, it starts to look like the expectation of the function f itself under some new measure. Okay, and indeed that's exactly the case. So we'll introduce a deformed, say psi deformed probability measure, Gibbs measure, which I will denote by mu, lambda, eta, psi. Okay, and say for an event A, it associates a probability which is 1 over z lambda eta psi integral 1a omega e minus h lambda of t psi omega lambda eta lambda complement, and then product over I in lambda d omega I. Okay? So I'm defining a new probability measure where the Hamiltonian has been modified. Instead of having Hamiltonian h lambda, the Hamiltonian now is h lambda composed with t psi. Okay? Now, again, because the Jacobian of the transformation is 1, you can repeat exactly what I did here, say with f is equal to 1, which gives you the fact that this quantity, the partition function, which is here, is actually equal. So this partition function here, it's equal to z lambda eta. Okay? Does not change anything, the rotation, because the Jacobian of the transformation is equal to 1. So you can go from this to this by just changing variables, which does not change anything. Okay. So now if I use this notation, I can finally rewrite. So this implies that the object I was interested in, which was the difference between the expectation of f under the original Gibbs measure and the expectation of f composed with the rotation under the original Gibbs measure, this is equal to the expectation of f under the original Gibbs measure minus the expectation of f under the new measure, which is deformed by this spin wave psi. Okay. So what I've achieved is that instead of comparing the expectation of two different functions under the same measure, I have now the expectation of the same function under two different probability measures. And now there are techniques to evaluate, to estimate the effect of the change of a probability measure on the expectation of a given function. Okay, that's what we are going to use now. So there are several ways of doing that. A very natural way of doing that is to use the relative entropy. So let me recall the relative entropy between two measures, say two probability measures, in our case mu and nu. It's defined, I will denote it like that, so that we do not confuse the notation with the Hamiltonian. So h mu nu is just the expectation of the log of d mu d nu under mu, if mu is absolutely continuous with respect to nu, and plus infinity otherwise. Okay. Where this quantity is, of course, okay, where d mu d nu is just the density of mu with respect to nu, so it's the Radon Nikodym derivative of mu with respect to mu. Okay. Probably I will ask the TA to study the basic properties of this relative entropy during the exercise sessions. Okay. But if he has no time to do that, or prefers to do something else, then you can read in the mathematical appendix at the end of the book. There is a section on this quantity where all the basic properties are stated and proved. And the one we are going to use is the following. So it's a lemma in the appendix, lemma A76. Maybe you will prove it in exercises, otherwise you can just read the proof. In the appendix, the proof is not very difficult. It's clever because you get a very good constant, so you need some clever tricks, but it's basically Jensen's inequality used at the right place. It's something which is called Pinsker's inequality. Pinsker inequality, which is exactly what we need. It's something that compares that upper bound, the total variation distance between two measures by the relative entropy between the two measures, and that's exactly what we'll need. So it tells you the following thing: the supremum overall function, measurable function f, with a sup norm which is smaller or equal to 1 of mu of f, or let me write it as we did here, expectation of f under mu minus expectation of f under nu. So exactly the kind of things we want. Okay. So we want to compare the expectation of f under two different probability measures. So if I want to do that, I can do that uniformly in all measurable functions which have a sup norm which is bounded by 1. And what you get is that this is smaller than square root of 2 times the relative entropy between mu and nu. Okay. I'm not going to prove that. You can either read it in the notes or you will do it in exercise. We'll see. Okay, it's not hard. Yeah, but we are going to use this. So that's exactly what we want, right? Now, this reduces, this Pinskers inequality, it reduces our problem of comparing this expectation under these two measures to estimating the relative entropy between the two measures. Okay? If I'm able to show that the relative entropy goes to 0 with n, as n goes to infinity, then I've proven the Mermin-Wagner theorem. Okay, so let's compute the relative entropy. In our case, it's particularly easy because I want the relative entropy, okay, if we look at it here, of the original Gibbs measure with respect to the psi-deformed Gibbs measure. Okay, and the psi-deformed Gibbs measure, it's written in a, so the partial function is the same, so this prefactor is the same in both cases. The only thing that changes is the Hamiltonian, so it's very easy to see immediately from the definition what is the density of the original Gibbs measure with respect to this one. The only thing I have to do, I have to add this Hamiltonian, exponential of plus this Hamiltonian, minus the original Hamiltonian. That gives me the density of the original Gibbs measure with respect to this one. So we immediately have that d mu lambda psi with respect to d mu lambda and eta psi. So this one, it's immediate that it's just exponential of, so I said I have to add this guy to remove it, h lambda t psi omega lambda eta lambda complement. And I have to subtract the original Hamiltonian to reconstruct the proper Boltzmann weight, eta lambda c. Okay. If I take the psi-deformed measure and multiply it by this, what I'm constructing is exactly the original Gibbs measure. Okay, so that's the relative, the Radon-Nikodym derivative. And now once I have this, I can compute the relative entropy between these two measures. Mu lambda eta with respect to mu lambda eta psi. What is it? Well, I have to take the expectation under this, lambda eta, okay, of the logarithm of this quantity. Okay, it's the definition which is here, the logarithm of this quantity. So logarithm of this quantity, we just remove the exponential and I have to compute the expectation of this. So it will be h lambda composed with t psi minus h lambda. Okay, that's all. So it's nice. It's nice because if you remember the heuristic argument we saw last week, so what we were doing, we were just looking at ground state. We were just looking at configuration of minimal energy. And what we saw is that if I choose properly my smoothly varying rotation, this inhomogeneous rotation that we were using, the spin wave, then the energetic cost of the spin wave was vanishing when the size of the box was getting larger and larger. Here we basically have the same thing. So I'm looking at the effect on the energy. That's the original energy. That's the energy after application of the spin wave. I'm comparing the energy before and after the spin wave I'm not doing this, I'm not looking at the configuration of minimal energy, I'm looking at the average change of energy when I apply the spin wave. Which is very similar to what we did in the heuristic argument. And indeed, we are going to reduce our computation exactly to what we did in the heuristic argument. Okay, so now we have to compute this expectation. Yeah. Okay, it's not very difficult. I can continue from here. So this is equal. And I just write the definition of H. So we know that H is just the sum. So there is a beta, probably, Ij in E lambda B. And then I have the expectation of, so it's not on the board anymore, but I introduce this function V of the angle. So it's V of theta j minus theta I plus psi j minus psi I. That's the difference of angle in the configuration after I've applied the rotation by psi. Okay? And I have to subtract the original one, which is theta j minus theta I. Expectation of this measure. Right? That's all we have. And now we do exactly what we did in the heuristic argument. So again, if you remember, in the heuristic argument, the way we made the computation is that we just Taylor expanded what would correspond to this term. Just made a Taylor expansion, we'll do the same. Let's make a Taylor expansion and see what comes out. So if I Taylor expand this quantity, so of course I don't want, okay, in the heuristic argument we were Taylor expanding around the ground state, so around the configuration theta equals 0. Here I don't want to do that because I would like to have a cancellation. So I will Taylor expand around the value theta j minus theta I, so that at least the 0th order term they cancel. Okay, and then I just look at correction. So this will be V of theta j minus theta I, that's 0 order term, plus V prime theta j minus theta I psi j minus psi I, fine, plus a second order term, 1/2 second derivative of V evaluated at some point Tij, the value of which will play no role, so let me not specify it. It's just something so that I can stop the Taylor expansion at this order, times psi j minus psi I square. Okay, that's an identity. Okay, I just Taylor expand, I'm using the fact that V is twice continuously differentiable. Okay, I can go to second order. Now, what do I get if I do that? So, then I get beta, sum overall Ij E lambda B. Then I get two types of terms. So I have one which is 1/2. Now it's the important term, so let me write it properly. It will be expected value of V second of this Tij, eta lambda psi j minus psi I square, plus beta sum over Ij E lambda B, expected value of V prime of theta j minus theta I, eta lambda psi j minus psi I. Right? Not done anything, just cancel the 0th order term. And now I argue exactly as we argued in the heuristic argument. The second derivative of V is a continuous function by assumption. V is twice continuously differentiable, so its second derivative is a continuous function. It's a continuous function on a compact set, the circle, unit circle, so it's bounded. So this quantity here, I don't know, this is a horrible random variable, this Tij, but I don't care about it because this guy is always smaller than a constant by assumption. Because V is smooth, it's twice continuously differentiable. Okay? So what we get is that this first order term, or this second order term, this first term in this expression is just exactly what we had in the heuristic argument. It's a constant, 1/2 beta c times the sum of psi j minus psi I square, which is exactly what we had in the heuristic argument. And then we have this second term, which is the first order term in psi. And this one is very bad. It's very, very bad for us. It's very bad because if you remember what happened here, so the best we could do for the psi, okay, I had not proved in last week that it was the best possible, but believe me, it was the best possible. The best you could do for that, for this gradient here, is something that behaves like 1 over the square root of the distance between I and j and 0. Okay? And so when we took the square, we had something which was just barely diverging. It was diverging logarithmically, and this was fine because we had a prefactor which was 1 over log square, and we could cancel, and things were still going to 0. But now here I would have 1 over the square root of the distance, and this would diverge. It would diverge very fast. So if this guy is there, our proof is just dead, and we cannot do anything. So we have to find a way to say that this guy is 0. It's not 0. In the heuristic argument, it was 0 because v prime was evaluated at 0, and v prime of 0 is 0 by symmetry. But here we are evaluating v prime at some random angle. There is absolutely no reason why v prime of this angle should be 0. It's not 0. Even the expectation is, in general, not 0, except for very special boundary conditions. So this quantity is not 0, so we have to find a clever way of getting rid of it. And there is a beautiful solution to this problem, beautiful because it's very, very simple. Even though the problem a priori is absolutely non-trivial, the solution is extremely simple and clever. And the solution is relying on the simplest property of the relative entropy, the first one you prove when you study the relative entropy, which is just an application of Jensen that tells you that this quantity is always non-negative. Always. Maybe it's plus infinity, but it's always non-negative. Okay? So let's do it. So h mu is larger or equal to 0 for any mu in U. That's always true. So I'm going to use this observation to solve this problem. And the way I'm solving it is as follows. So we are interested in the relative entropy between this measure and the psi deformation of this measure, right? But this is certainly smaller than itself. It's exactly the same quantity I've written a second time. Plus, I'm adding something non-negative. And what I'm adding is the relative entropy between the original Gibbs measure and the minus psi deformed Gibbs measure. Right? This is non-negative because it's always non-negative. Okay? In particular, it's non-negative here. This is exactly the same thing, except that instead of using the spin wave psi, I'm using the spin wave minus psi. Okay? It's just all the rotations are made in the other direction. And now you take this quantity and you make the same computation we did here. The only thing that changes is the sign of psi. Psi is minus psi, right? So what happens is that for the second order term here, it depends on the square of psi j minus psi I, so it is unaffected by the computation. But the first order term, the one we have a problem with, the sign changes here, okay? So when I add the two relative entropy, the first order term disappears, and the only thing I get is a factor 2 for the second order term. It just solves our problem completely. So this is equal, okay, this is small or equal C beta. There is no over 2 because I get twice the second order term, but that's not much to pay to get rid of the first order term. Okay? And then I have the sum over all ij. And then I get psi j minus psi I square. Right? So we have this bound on the relative entropy. And now, in some sense, we are done. It's over because last week, when doing the heuristic argument, we obtained exactly the same sum as here. And we saw that we could choose psi in a suitable way so that this goes to 0 and it goes to infinity. But I don't want to do that. So I would like now to find the optimal psi, because first, it's nice, and second, it will show what is the role of the dimension here. Why does it work in dimension 1 and 2? Why does it fail in dimension 3 and higher? And so it's useful. So what is the optimal psi? So the one that makes this quantity as small as possible. So let me give a name to this quantity. Actually, it has a name. It's well known. So E of psi. I will just normalize it slightly differently. So the constant, I will just put a 1/2. So this quantity, E lambda b psi j minus psi I square. And actually, since this is constant inside BL and constant outside the box lambda, I can remove BL. It doesn't change anything. I'm removing 0. Okay. So this quantity is what is called the Dirichlet energy, or the Dirichlet form associated to this function. So it's Dirichlet energy. Energy of psi. Okay. And what we want to do is we want to minimize, to find the function psi that minimizes the Dirichlet energy, conditionally on the fact that we need this boundary condition that I introduced earlier. So we want psi to be 0 outside the box and to be equal to minus psi inside the small box BL. Okay. So let me state the corresponding lemma, which gives you the best possible such psi. So it's here. It's lemma 814. Lemma 814. So the Dirichlet energy possesses a unique minimizer among functions, among all functions u from ZD to R, such that ui is equal to 0 for all I not in lambda, and say j is equal to it's equal to 1. I'll just normalize it this way for all j in BL. Okay, take this boundary condition. The boundary condition we want is 0 and minus psi, but it's very easy to go from one to the other. It just gives you a psi square outside, which comes out. So it's not a big deal. It's convenient to state it in this way because it gives nice formulas. If I do it like that. Okay, it has a unique minimizer, and we can write it explicitly. This minimizer is given by, I will write it U star. U star at I is just given by the probability starting at I that the simple random walk on ZD, the symmetric simple random walk on ZD, okay, enters the box BL before exiting lambda. Exiting lambda. So that's the minimizer we want. That's the best possible choice you can make for this function psi. And then what is the value of the Dirichlet energy evaluated at the minimum? And what you get, so moreover, the Dirichlet energy evaluated at the minimum is given by d, so the dimension, times the sum over all j in the interior boundary of BL. You go along the boundary of the square BL, but you only look inside in the inner boundary. Okay. And then you have the probability starting from j that x exits lambda before returning to BL. Okay, you get things like that. So of course I'm going to prove this, but before proving this lemma, I want to show how using this lemma we conclude the proof of the proposition. Okay, so at first I conclude the proof of the proposition, then we prove this lemma. It's very easy to do. It's just computation. So let's use this to conclude. So now I will choose psi. So we choose psi is equal to minus small psi u star. Okay. So now psi has the right boundary condition. It's equal to minus psi inside the box BL and 0 outside the box. And then it interpolates between the two values. Okay. This implies that E of psi is just psi square E of u star. Okay. Which is okay. And therefore, we get that what we are looking for, so the expectation of f under the original Gibbs measure minus the expectation of f composed with the rotation by psi under the original Gibbs measure. So if I take everything we have done, we know that this is smaller than square root of 2 times the relative entropy. And the relative entropy, we have just bounded it here, so there is a C beta. There will be a psi square. Okay. And then there will be this Dirichlet energy. There was a 1/2 in Dirichlet energy, so probably I have to put a 4 here, I don't know, whatever. And then E of u star. Okay? Something like that. Not sure about the constants, but basically it's what you get. Okay. And then the only thing we have to check is that indeed E of u star is going to 0 at the rate which were prescribed, or at least it's going to 0 and then goes to infinity. The rates were just a bonus. But what we really want to understand is this. Okay, so let me write exactly what is this E of u star. I want to bound it by something which is more explicit. So d sum over all j in the inner boundary of BL, probability starting from j, that x exits lambda before returning to BL. I want just to bound roughly this quantity by something which you know goes to 0 and then goes to infinity in dimension 1 and 2, but not in higher dimension. And then the precise asymptotic I gave with this 1 over root n, 1 over square root of log n is just given by random walk estimates, so, which I will not do, of course. So this probability, maybe I will just work with the probability. So this probability here, this one is certainly smaller than the probability starting from j that x exits the box j plus b. Remember that lambda is just bn. It was a notation for bn. Okay. J plus b n minus l. It's n minus l. I don't know if you can read. Hope so. Before returning to j. Returning to j. So I'm making very rough bounds. I hope it's readable. So the picture is just the following. So we have lambda, we have Bn, then you have Bl. Let me exaggerate the size of Bl. Of course, Bn is much, much larger than Bl. Then you have some point J here in the inner boundary of Bl. And what I'm saying is that what the event we have here is that the random walk exits the box Bn before returning to the box Bl. I take an event which is much smaller. I ask the walk to exit this smaller box, so it's easier to exit a small box than a big one, okay? Before returning precisely to the point J. It's harder to return to J than to return to BL, yes?
But you could exit this small yellow box being inside BL.
No, in principle, okay, maybe there is a +1 or something like that, but this is exactly the box. So it's translated by J. So I'm taking a box which has exactly the right radius so that they coincide. The boundary of this, the green box here and the original box, they coincide. Right? So maybe it's Bn minus L plus 1 or something like that. I'm not completely sure about my definitions, but it doesn't change anything for what I'm going to say. Right? But you agree? I mean, you see, if I have to exit, every time I exit lambda, I've already exited this green box, so it's easier. Okay? So it makes the probability bigger. Now, returning to BL is easier than returning to J. So both things go in the right direction, and this is certainly larger. And the advantage that this I can rewrite as by spatial homogeneity is the same as starting from 0. x exits the box B n minus L before returning to 0. Returning to 0. So when n goes to infinity, now if I let n go to infinity, what happens for this quantity? Well, it's the probability that my random walk goes very, very, very far away from the origin before returning to the origin. This goes to 0 when n goes to infinity, when the random walk is recurrent. Okay? And if and only if the random walk is recurrent. So this goes to 0 as n goes to infinity, if and only if x is recurrent, which happens if and only if dimension is 1 or 2. Okay? Now, the rate at which this happens is just an estimate with green function and things like that. You can read it in books by Lawler, Spitzer, and all these things about random walks. If you want, you can look at it. This will give you this 1 over root n or 1 over root of log n. 1 over root n is trivial. It's basically Gambler's rule estimate. So this you can do. The two-dimensional case is slightly more involved, but it's not very hard. This is done in the beginning of the book by Lawler, for example, intersection of random walks. And then you get exactly this 1 over square root of log n. But for us, it's enough to know that this goes to 0, and this proves everything we want. Okay, so in dimension 1 and 2, we have obtained an upper bound on this, which is vanishing when the size of the box diverges. So the only thing I still have to prove is this lemma 814, which I will do after the break. So we start at 20 past. Okay, we'll resume. Maybe before I go on with the proof, let me just make an announcement. So next week there will be an interchange of two courses. So my course will be on Friday and Hugo's course will be on Tuesday because he's not there at the end of the week. Okay. So otherwise nothing changes. Okay, so let's move on to the proof of this lemma, which will conclude the proof of the proposition. The proof of lemma 814. Okay, we have a completely explicit and not very complicated functional. We want to find its minimizer, so we start by looking for its critical points. Critical points of this functional. Always, I will always be working on this set of functions which vanish outside the box lambda and which are equal to 1 inside BL. Okay. I will not repeat it all the time, but I'm always working on this set. So the critical points, they are characterized. So U is a critical point of E if and only if the derivative with respect to S of U, of E of U plus S delta is evaluated at S equals 0 is equal to 0 for all function delta from ZD to R such that delta I is equal to 0 for all I not in lambda minus BL. Okay? You see, I start with a function which is in this set of functions I'm interested in. I'll perturb it in an arbitrary way by a function delta, which keeps it inside this set, so delta has to vanish outside lambda and inside BL, so that the boundary conditions are not affected. And then I want this to be I'm looking for critical points, so I want the derivative to be equal to 0 at 0. Okay, so now the only thing we have to do is to compute this derivative. So DDS E U plus S delta at S is equal to 0. This is equal. So let's look at U, at E. E is here. So, okay, let me write it down. I'm just lazy, but let's. So what is this? This is the 1/2, the sum over this ij in E lambda minus BL B. And then we have Uj plus S delta J minus Ui minus S delta I square. Okay. And then when I compute this Oh, okay. Okay, that's one way to write it down. So when I expand the square and I look what is remaining, so only the terms which are linear in S will remain, because when I compute derivative of the terms which are linear in S and take S equals 0, I get a constant. The constant term, they just vanish when I compute the derivative, and the quadratic term, they vanish when I take S equals 0. Okay, so the only thing that will remain is 1/2 sum over all ij in E lambda minus BL B, and gradient U ij, gradient delta ij. Okay, just a computation, just expand. This is really 1/2 sum of gradient psi square, so gradient psi plus S delta, it's gradient U plus gradient S delta, and you just expand, you get that. Okay, and then what we want to do here, so I want to have the result valid for any delta. I want to find a conditional U valid for any delta. So I don't want to have gradient delta here, I would like to have a delta, so I make a summation by part. So summation by part is what we did 2 weeks ago, this discrete green identity. It was the first one. So let's use it. If I use it, I first get a minus 1/2 sum over all I in lambda minus BL, delta I, Laplacian U at I, that's the first term, and then we get a boundary term, which is a plus 1/2 sum over all I in lambda minus BL, J not in lambda minus BL, I neighboring J, and then we get delta J gradient U ij. Okay, that's just summation by part. And now you observe that here things are particularly simple because the function delta have to vanish outside lambda and inside BL. So since J here is not in lambda minus BL, it's either outside lambda or inside BL, so this is always equal to 0. So this term is equal to 0. Okay, so this term is not here, and we have only that. And now we know that U is critical if and only if this quantity vanishes, and the only way for this quantity to vanish for all possible choice of delta is that the Laplacian is 0. So this has to be equal to 0. So we get that the critical points of the Dirichlet energy, they satisfy their harmonic in this harmonic inside lambda minus BL with the boundary conditions which are specified here. So this implies, okay, we conclude that U is critical for E if and only if U is the unique solution to the massless Dirichlet problem in lambda minus BL with boundary condition eta I equal to 0 for all I not in lambda, and eta, say J, equal to 1 for all J in BL. Right? But now we know what is the unique solution. We computed it in the previous chapter. So this is equivalent to saying that UI, or it's, okay, UI, or let me call it UI star. There is a unique one, I call it UI star, and we'll check that it's indeed the minimum. So UI star is equal to the expected value starting from I of eta x tau lambda minus BL complement. That's just the formula we saw 2 weeks ago, I guess, derived 2 weeks ago. And now, since the boundary condition, so now we let x evolve inside lambda minus BL, and then at some point either it exits lambda or it enters BL. And if it exits lambda, we collect 0. If it enters BL, we collect 1. So when we collect 0, we just get no contribution, so I can forget about it. So the only thing that can happen is that I get a 1 when I exit BL before exiting lambda. So I get 1 times the probability that x exits, enters BL before exiting lambda, right? So that's the only critical point of the Dirichlet energy is this function, which is exactly what we want. Let's check that it's indeed a minimizer. second point, U star is a minimizer. It's kind of obvious given the what is the Dirichlet form, but it's nice to see how nicely things are working. So I'm looking at the energy of U star plus delta. Delta is an arbitrary perturbation. Any function which satisfies this boundary condition, I can write it as U star plus delta for delta which is 0 outside lambda and 0 inside BL. So I do it this way. And this is, you just expand the square, you get the Dirichlet energy of U star, the Dirichlet energy of delta, and the cross term, which is 1/2 sum over all ij in E lambda minus BL B, gradient U ij, gradient delta ij, but we've seen that's the computation we've just made. Here, this quantity is equal to 0 plus this guy, but this guy is 0 by the choice of U star, so it's 0. So this is 0, always. This quantity, the energy of delta, is always non-negative, it's a sum of squares. It's always non-negative, so we conclude that this is larger than E of U star for any delta, such that delta I equal to 0 for all I not in lambda minus BL. Okay, so it's indeed yes, it's indeed a minimizer. So it's the smallest value I can get for Mongol delta. It's when delta equals 0. Okay, so that we have a minimizer. It's a unique minimizer of this functional. The only thing I still have to show is that if I evaluate the Dirichlet energy at the minimizer, I get the expression which is written here. So it's basically it's basically the probability that X exits lambda before returning to BL. So let's do it. It's a simple computation again. So third step, evaluation of E of U star. Okay, so E of U star is 1/2 sum over all ij of gradient U star ij square. And then again, I use this the discrete Green identity. This is minus 1/2 sum over I in lambda minus BL U star I, Laplacian U star I, plus 1/2 sum over all I in lambda minus BL J not in lambda minus BL I neighboring J U star J gradient U star ij. Okay. And then what can we say about these guys? So this is 0. So this is 0. This term is not here. Here, what can we say? So U star. So this U star. Here. J is not in lambda minus BL. So this is equal either to 1 if J is in BL, or to 0 if J is not in lambda. Right? That's the only two possibilities. And again, this, okay, let me write it also in green. So this gradient U star ij, by definition, it's U star j minus U star I. Okay? And again, U star j is the same as this U star j, so it's equal to that. So if I make this, if I bring all this together, what I get is 1/2. So this term I said vanishes. Sum over all I in lambda minus BL, J in BL, okay, I neighboring J. So immediately I get that if J is in BL, I is a neighbor of J, so I is not any point in lambda minus BL. Actually, it has better be in the exterior boundary of BL. Okay, otherwise they cannot be neighbors. Maybe the J has no neighbors outside, but then the sum is empty. And then I get 1, this is 1 when J is in BL, times 1 minus U star, UI star. just computations. And now you substitute UI star, we have computed it. It's the probability that the random walk enters BL before exiting the box lambda. Well, 1 minus UI star will just be the probability of the complementary event. Okay. So what we have, this is equal to 1/2 sum over all I in the exterior boundary of BL, J in BL, actually in the interior boundary of BL, otherwise there is no neighbors. Okay. Let me put it. Interior boundary of BL, otherwise the sum is just empty. And then I get the probability starting at J, so what was, yes, we still have it. So U star, no, I wanted it at I, so starting at I, it's this U star I here. Probability of the complement of this event, so probability that X exits lambda before entering BL. Okay? And now we just have to play a little bit with it to get the form I gave before. And one first observation is that this is also 1/2 sum over all I in, okay, let me do it like that, sum over all J in the interior boundary of BL, sum over all I neighboring J. Yes. Probability that X exits lambda before entering BL. Okay. Why can I do that? Because this guy, this color. Okay, this probability is equal to 0 if I belongs to BL, because of course, if I'm already inside BL at time 0, then I cannot exist lambda before entering BL. I'm already there. Okay, so I'm adding 0. So removing the constraint that I is in the external boundary of BL and taking all neighbors of J does not change anything because I'm just adding zeros. Okay, so I can do it this way, but that's nice because now I can just put 1 over 2D here, and I have to compensate with a 2D here. Okay, and then this quantity which is here, to this quantity I can apply the Markov property and write it as probability starting from J. So that's probability that I'm going from J to I, and then probability starting from I, summing over all neighbors of J. So it's the same as probability starting from J, that X exits lambda before returning to BL. And that's exactly what was claimed. Okay, the 2 Ds. Simplify. That's exactly the claim. So this concludes the proof of this lemma and then of the proposition. Okay, so that's the proof for the case of unit vectors in R2, so taking value in the circle. And as I said, you can reduce the general result for, say, in the n sphere when n is greater or equal to 2. You can always reduce it to the case n equal to 2. Maybe I just explain roughly the idea and you will do the details in exercises. The idea is just if you take, say, a rotation in R3, you want to show the same thing with the sphere in dimension 3. Okay? And the point is that you can always find an orthonormal basis of your space such that the rotation that you have in R3 can be written as a composition of rotation around coordinate axes. Okay? But each of these rotation around coordinate axes, it maintains everything. It's acting just in planes, and inside each of the plane, what I see is exactly a model which is in the circle, valued in the circle. So you reduce, in this way, you reduce the proof to the proof in the case n equal to 2. You will do the details. It's really a very simple argument, but it's nice to see that you can do it in such an elementary way. So I won't do it here. We'll do it in the exercise. Instead, what I would like to do is to talk a bit about the decay of correlations in these models. Another beautiful argument, but the argument we'll probably see it next week. I just want to motivate things now. So we have seen that Merlin-Wagner theorem, it gives you, that's the exercise that I stated before, it gives you some estimate on the rate of decay, say SI, Sj. So you fix I, you let J go to infinity, and I claim that in any Gibbs state, this decays like a constant, okay, it depends on the dimension. Okay, let me do constant over square root of J minus I, dimension 1, and a constant over square root of log of J minus I in dimension 2, okay, for any Gibbs state. Okay. The problem, what is not very nice is that these bounds turn out to be very, very bad. Okay, so it would be nice to do better. So why do I say that they are very poor? So in dimension 1, I won't do it, but you can do it as an exercise. It's not difficult to prove this kind of thing. There are many ways of proving that. In dimension 1, it's not hard to show that the decay is always exponential. For nearest neighbor interactions, it's only for very, very long range interaction that things are more complicated, but for any reasonable interaction, the decay of correlation is always exponentially small. So at all temperature, SI is J is smaller than E minus C J minus I for all beta. Okay. So obviously 1 over square root of the distance is pretty poor. Right? It should be exponential always. The argument is similar to what you saw in the Ising model, for example, with a high temperature expansion. Okay, you can do the same kind of things here. There are also very general proofs that work for basically any model. Okay. Then in dimension 2, as we will see, the decay actually will be algebraic. Okay, so it's better, but still far from optimal. And I will give much more details about what is known and what one can do in dimension 2, but I will not do it now. I will do it next week after the proof. Okay. So what we are going to do now is to look at the case of dimension 2. So in the case n equal to 2. We are going to derive good upper bounds in the case d equal to, and the model is just the XY model to simplify. The argument works more generally, but I will just do it for the XY model. So remember the one where so the spinors take value in the circle, and the interaction just the scalar product, minus the scalar product between SI and SJ. Okay. But before doing that, so before providing you with good upper bounds on the decay of the correlation SI-SJ, I want to give you some heuristics, try to guess what the answer should be. Okay. How should this correlation decay when I and J get far away from each other? So this we can guess. We can guess because we know, because of all we know about the Gaussian free field. So let me try to explain this. So a heuristic argument So again, I will write, since I'm working with the XY model, I can write SI as cos theta I, sin theta I as before, and work with the angle, always more convenient. Okay. And then what I will do is that I will take a big box. So lambda is Bn, large N. And then I will take boundary conditions which are given by E1, so theta equals 0. E1 boundary condition. So all the spins are pointing toward the right. Okay. Then I want to compute the expected value of SI scalar product Sj, okay, with this E1 boundary condition in the box lambda inverse temperature beta. Okay. That's what I want to do. So again, this I can write as cosine of theta j minus theta I, E1 lambda beta. And this, by symmetry, I'm just doing heuristics, so I chose boundary condition which simplify my life, so I can use symmetry to say that this is just the expectation of E, that's the square root of -1. I try to write the I differently from these I's. Tell me if you can see the difference. Theta j minus theta I, E1 lambda beta. Why? Because the imaginary part, the sine part, vanishes with this boundary condition. You can check that by symmetry, it gives you, the expectation is 0. Okay, so you get this. So I want to compute this the same as computing that. And now I start doing heuristic. At the moment, there is nothing heuristic there. It's just a trivial computation. Let's start doing heuristics. So I want to understand the decay at low temperature. Why? Because, again, there are very, very general results that tell you that if you're at high temperature, so beta is very small, the decay is always exponential in all reasonable models. Decay is always exponential at small beta. And so of course we know that this is very bad and it's very easy to derive this exponential decay, so I don't want to spend time doing the small beta case, which is easy. I want to spend time doing the large beta case, which is where difficult things are located. So let's assume that beta is very large. So if beta is very large, I can approximate the Hamiltonian. So remember the Hamiltonian, it looks like, so I said it was the XY model, so it's minus beta, sum over all these ij's. I will write it with the cosine. Okay. So that's just the Hamiltonian. And then what we expect is that when beta is very large, the configuration which gets the highest weight, for which the Boltzmann weight is maximal, are those in which the spins are almost all aligned, very, very closely aligned to each other. So we expect that when beta is very large, theta j is minus theta I is much smaller than 1 typically for all ij neighbors. Okay. We expect that this should be true because, okay, if this is not true, it's very costly when beta is very large to have a large angle because the cosine is far from -1. Minus cosine is far from -1. Okay, so that means that I should be able to replace this by an approximation, which is minus beta, sum over all these ij's. And this will be just replaced by 1 minus 1/2 theta j minus theta I square. Okay, I just Taylor expand the cosine because I expect that typically theta j minus theta is very small, so the error I'm making is very small. It's heuristic, so I can do that. Okay. So this should not be too bad, such a bad approximation. So this is what? This is just minus beta times the number of edges, so it's just a constant which is irrelevant. Doesn't change anything to the Gibbs measure. And then we get plus beta over 2 sum over all ij theta j minus theta I square. So what do we conclude from that? Now, again, because of this, it's not completely unreasonable to believe that the fact that the angle theta, they have some periodicity, they live in the circle, so in between minus pi and pi, okay? This should not have such a major role on the property, because in any case, when you go from one point to its neighbors, you just see very tiny rotations typically. So I should get exactly the same kind of result if I allow theta j minus theta, each of my angle theta to take value in R instead of values in the circle. So let's assume that. If you assume that, we see that the Hamiltonian of the XY model at inverse temperature beta is just the same as the Hamiltonian of the GFF at a temperature which is 4 beta, I think. Okay, because of the normalization we had. So in dimension 2 it was beta over 8, 4D. Beta over 4D. So XY at beta should be roughly the same, especially, I mean, the fact that the fact that needs some justification is the fact that I can forget about the fact that they live on the circle and replace the circle by R. But you see that the function that I want to compute here is something which in any case it's 2 pi periodic, EI something. So the fact that I'm living in R on the circle doesn't change anything because this is periodic with period 2 pi. So Xi at beta is basically the same thing as GFF at 4 beta large. At least at a heuristic level, certainly one would expect something like that. Okay? But that's nice because that means if I want to compute this, then I can make the same computation in the GFF. So let's do that. So this implies that Si Sj E1 lambda beta, this should be approximately expectation of I. So in the GFF, I denote the spins by phi, if you remember. So it's phi j minus phi I. The boundary condition E1, which corresponds to theta equals 0. So it's just 0 boundary condition. Let me put GFF so that we know that now we're computing things with respect to the GFF. In the box lambda at temperature inverse temperature 4 beta. Okay. But now that's an easy computation. That's not an easy computation, but that's an easy computation. And let's do it. So phi j minus phi I, it's a Gaussian random variable. Under the measure with 0 boundary condition, it's easy to check that it has 0 mean. It's basically obvious. It follows from what we have done. If it's not obvious, just compute. And then with the variance, let me call it sigma square ij, okay, which is given the variance under this measure lambda. Let me think. Okay, just a second. Before okay, I will do it like that. So variance 4 beta. The boundary condition we saw it does not change anything, but of phi, we'll compute it in a second. The point is that the computation we made in this chapter on the GFF was under the assumption that the inverse temperature is 1. Okay. And then we have to make change of variable. So let me make the computation when the inverse temperature is 1, and then we just change variable. GFF lambda 1 of phi j minus phi I. And then this is just what it's okay. The variance of a sum is the sum of the variance plus the covariance of variance of phi j plus variance always under the same measure. I will not repeat it all the time. Variance, say, let me just put the lambda phi I minus twice the covariance in lambda of phi I phi j. Right? Just the covariance, just the variance of a sum. Okay. But now we know what these guys are. So the variance of phi j is g lambda jj. That's what we computed when we studied the GFF. It's just the green function in lambda evaluated at j. That's j lambda I, and that's j lambda ij. Okay. So that means that this quantity, if now you put back the 4 beta and you make the change of variables so that you recover the dependence in beta, what you get is g lambda, say I plus g lambda jj minus 2 g lambda ij over 4 beta. just a computation. Now, that's just, so now we know that this Gaussian random vector has a given law, which we know, though it's parameters. Now we just have to compute the characteristic function of this random vector. So this you know how to do. So this implies that E I phi j minus phi I, this is just, so the mean is 0, so you don't get any term for the mean, but we get a term for the variance, so E minus 1/2. Then we get the sigma square, which we just computed, G lambda I plus G lambda Jj minus 2G lambda Ij, and over for beta, which makes 8 beta if I've made no mistake in my computations. And then the only thing we still have to understand is what happens to when lambda goes to ZD with this quantity. And what you can prove with random walk estimate is that this, as lambda goes to ZD, I will give more details next week when we do the actual proof, not just the heuristic. But this goes to, I've written it somewhere, I'm sure, 2 over pi log of j minus I. So is it okay? Oh, with the 1, okay, that's bad. Let me 4 beta with 1/2. So this part with the 1/2. Okay. This goes to, what did I say? 2 over pi log of j minus I, okay, plus something of order 1. So if I put everything together, this behaves like E minus 1 over 2 beta pi, 2 pi beta, j minus I, which means that it's j minus I to the power 1 minus 1 over 2 pi beta. Okay, so that's what we could conjecture from this argument. So the 2-point function in the XY model at large beta, it should decay like a power of j minus I, and the power is minus 1 over 2 pi beta, depends on the temperature. Okay. That's the conjecture. And now let's turn to the proofs. At least I want to state the...
Is it valid only for like large enough distance?
The computation, yes, because the approximation of the XY model by the GFF that we made here is only justified when beta is large. Okay. And actually, when beta is small, it's very easy to show, as I said, that this quantity decays exponentially fast, which is not the case for the GFF. Right? GFF, the decay is always the same. So let me turn to 842. Algebraic decay at low temperature. And let me state the theorem which we are going to prove. So let's consider an arbitrary infinite volume Gibbs state. Okay, for the XY model on Z2. Okay, at inverse temperature beta, okay. Then for any epsilon positive, there exists beta 0 of epsilon such that for any beta larger than epsilon, any beta larger than beta 0 of epsilon, so at large enough temperature, at low enough temperature, large enough beta, you have the following. For any ij in Z2, Si scalar product Sj, that this is smaller than some constant times j minus I says 2 minus 1 plus epsilon over 2 pi beta. We are going to prove that. And notice that up to the epsilon, which is arbitrary, it's exactly the exponent we got in the conjecture, right? prove exactly that. The proof will be amazingly simple, given the kind of claim we are after. It's very similar to what we have done today. Again, there will be a kind of spin wave, which we will introduce. But there is a twist, which is kind of interesting. Instead of making a real rotation of all the spins, like we did in the proof today, what we are going to do is an imaginary rotation of all the spins. So we are going to rotate the angle in the complex plane. So adding an imaginary part to the angle. But otherwise, the idea is the same, and it might look strange. So why the hell should we start going to the complex plane to do that? So let me try to motivate why this is very natural. I mean, very natural. Okay, you will see if you find it very natural or not. Motivation for the proof that will come next week. And I will stop after the motivation. So if you look at the computation I did in this heuristic case, at some point I wrote that. Okay, so I had a random variable, which was, I had z, which was a random variable, which was, say, n0 sigma square, okay? like phi j minus phi I, this particular sigma square. Okay? And then we were computing the expectation of E I z, and I was saying that this is E minus 1/2 sigma square. Okay. How do you prove that? Okay, I know you know how to prove that, but let me just do the proof, because I want to say that it's exactly the kind of thing we are going to do for the XY model. So what we do when we prove that, we are making an imaginary translation. So let's do it. So how do you prove that? So this is just it. Okay, 1 over square root of 2 pi sigma square, then the integral over R of E I, say x, minus 1 over 2 sigma square x square dx, right? Yes?
Sorry, at the bottom actually.
Here?
Yes, so it is 2 pi beta.
2 pi beta. It's exactly the same exponent as we got here.
But why we can't let beta goes to beta c inside? So c depends on beta. So what?
So this measure depends on beta, right? Okay. Now you fix. You fix some small error you are ready to make in the upper bound. So fix some epsilon. Then if you take beta large enough, depending on how much you are ready to lose in the upper bound here, then you can. You're saying that it's going to, maybe just the sign that is wrong. Let me just check. Oh, yes, it's too good, you say. Okay, then it's minus. Okay, thank you. Okay, sure. Okay, you pay something. Actually, you can make the computation slightly more efficiently than I will do next week, and see that the first order in beta, the term of order 1 over beta is correct, and the error is really of order 1 over beta square. So, but I will not do that because it's annoying computation. So let's look at this. So this is just by definition, if I've made no mistake, it seems to be correct, like that. And then the usual way of computing this is you first complete the square here. So that's 1 over 2 pi sigma square root, integral over R. And then let me complete the square. So it will be E minus 1 over 2 sigma square x minus I sigma square. Let me write something and check if it's okay. So I get x square over 2 sigma square, which is this one with a minus 1, so it's fine. The mixed term gives me minus 2i sigma square x over 2 sigma square. The 2 sigma square disappears, it's exactly minus ix, seems to be okay. And then I get an additional term which does not depend on x, which is just e minus sigma square over 2. Okay? Not done anything at the moment, just completed the square. Now, the observation, let me do it on this board, the picture. I know you know how to do this computation, just to stress the similarity with what we are going to do next week. Okay, so we want to integrate over the real line this particular function. And what is annoying here is this I sigma square. I'd like to get rid of it. So I would like to move the path of integration to r plus I sigma square. Okay. So this is easy to do. What you do is you fix some t minus t. You look at the integral over, let me change color, say this one. Look at the integral over this path. Okay? Then it's very easy to check that first the integral over the path is 0 by Cauchy theorem because this function here is analytic. Okay? Now, it's easy to check that when t goes to infinity, the contribution of these two vertical pieces, it vanishes. Vanish as t goes to infinity. And then what remains, what you conclude is that since the integral over this path is 0, means that the integral over the real line is equal to the integral over the real line shifted by I sigma square. Okay, so this is equal to E minus sigma square over 2, square root of 2 pi sigma square, integral over R plus I sigma square, E minus 1 over 2 sigma square, Z minus I sigma square dz. Okay. Just integrating over this, and now you have an integral over a path in the complex plane. You have to parameterize the path, and if you do that, what you get is that this integral, okay, that was a mistake. This integral here is just the integral again over R of E minus 1 over 2 sigma square t square, because along this path, when I parameterize, I just get the t de plus I sigma square minus I sigma square, it just vanishes, dt. And then this you know how to compute. This is square root of 2 pi sigma square, which will cancel with this square root of 2 pi sigma square, and you get exactly minus sigma square over 2, which is what we want. Okay? But the point is, I want you to see is that what we have really done is we have made an imaginary translation of the variable of integration. Okay? Here we have made an imaginary translation from the real line to the real line plus I sigma square. Imaginary translation of the variable of integration. And what we are going to do next week is exactly the same thing, except that what we are going to translate, we are going to apply an imaginary translation to all the spins variables, all the theta, all these angles. Okay? But the proof will be exactly the same, working not on the GFF. We are, at no point will work with the GFF. We'll always stick with the XY model, and we'll make exactly the same kind of proof we have made here, and see that it actually goes through. It's not at all obvious that it should work, but it will work. Okay. And then probably we'll start next week another chapter in which we are going to see how we, so in this chapter we have seen that these models with continuous spins, with continuous symmetry, in low dimension they don't have ordering, no spontaneous magnetization, no orientation along range order. But it would be interesting to understand how you prove that you have ordering in these models, say in higher dimension, for example, or various different situations. And we don't have the tools to do that for the moment because Peier's type argument, they have no chance to work. Because we have seen that when you have defects in the configuration here, typically, so if you try to force the spin in the middle of your box to be aligned opposite to the boundary condition, the energy is not concentrated in some localized defect. It's spread out over the whole lattice. Okay, so there is no way to try to introduce contours or things like that. It will not work because the energy of the defects is not concentrated, spatially concentrated. It's really spread out over the lattice. So we need some new techniques. These new techniques that I will introduce is reflection positivity. It's in a chapter which is not yet on the internet because I'm not yet happy with the chapter at all, but I will put it on Camilo so that you can have some notes. Okay, but it's not as well finished as the rest of the book for the moment. Okay, thank you.